So my name is Breck Parkman. I didn't change my name to Parkman. I worked 40 years for state parks. It just happened to be that way. I'm a storyteller. Some people think I'm a scientist, but I'm really a storyteller. And I tell people that I'm a bus driver. And here's why I like to say I'm a bus driver, is because I know a lot of people, I have a lot of ideas. I love to find people with ideas, and I'll say, where do you want to go? Get on the bus, and I'll try to get you there. So over the last 40 years, I've worked with people like Robin and Father Alexander and Native people, my friends from Kashaya, and people will say, we need to do this or we need to do that. And then working through the government, I try to help find ways to do that. Restoration of the Russian cemetery was one of those projects, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. So what I'm going to do today, and can you still hear me in the back? If I get too far away, tell me. I've got a wobbly leg today. I'm getting over a fall. So if I wince, don't worry. If I stuff funny. I'm going to tell a series of stories, 5 in fact, about Fort Ross. So starting with the first one, I just thought I'd tell a little bit really fast about my involvement in Fort Ross to set the scene for some of the other things I'll talk about. I went to Fort Ross in 1983. I took a crew with me. That's my crew. And have you ever seen, I won't ask if you've used it, but have you ever seen those 2 comfort stations behind the, what would that be, the Rochef house in the corner of the compound? I dug the pits for those. My crew dug the pits for those. And they're still there, so we did a pretty good job. That was my first project at Fort Ross, digging latrines. Projects got a little more interesting after that. Here we are, though, excavating the pits for those 2 Shasta composting toilets. I've done a number, Robin has talked me into a number of times doing living history, and here I am dressed up like, I suppose, a Russian serf. I'm not an officer, I'm not a priest, I think I'm a worker here, but it was a lot of fun. Some of you have probably done this as well. That's my friend Huell, the late Huell Hauser. Who remembers Huell Hauser, California's Gull? Yeah, I was fortunate working in state parks all through Northern California to work with Huell on, I think, 5 of his shows. And the very first one was at Fort Ross in 1991. That was one of Huell's first shows. It was a blast. And some other time, I'll tell you about that day. There was a famous Soviet broadcaster from Moscow there, also recording the events. And he and Huell hooked up and did this amazing interview. And I looked at the 2 of them talking through they both had mics, and it's like, our world's about to change. Something's about to happen. I'll mention that in a minute. I used to live in Sebastopol. Now I live in Sonoma. I used to live in Sebastopol, and I called it Parkman Hotel because if there were visiting dignitaries from Alaska or Russia, I would often meet people in town. They would bring people from San Francisco Airport to my house. I'd put them overnight, feed them, and then I would give them to Fort Ross the next day. I met some amazing people doing that. Dr. Alexei Istomin here on the right, Dr. Black from University of Alaska on the left. I became integrated into Fort Ross in sort of what I thought was a very meaningful way, but not as a scientist, sort of as the bus driver, getting people around. We created in 1996 the Fort Ross Global Village Project. Probably no one here knows about that other than Robin, but I wanted to do a project using the internet to bring Russian and California school kids together studying Fort Ross. UNESCO sponsored my project, and no money, but just said, we like it. And we did 4 years of work. At the time, they couldn't give us funding because of politics, but I worked with 30 school teachers in Alaska, California, and Russia, and we did some great things. I ended the project in 2000, but still today in Irkutsk in Siberia, there's the Fort Ross Club, which was created to work with us on the project, and they're still there. There I am at one of the meetings on the far right. Lovely people. I've been over a number of times in Siberia to teach classes as part of the Fort Ross project. If you ever get a chance, this is a paper I published years ago about how to interpret Fort Ross. My trouble is the word fort. Fort kind of confuses a lot of people, and I like settlement a lot better, or colony. Fortified settlement it's sort of, if you go to Europe today, old Europe, you'll see fortified centers, city centers. but the town goes out miles beyond that. So imagine that for Colony Ross, a fortified center, but a lot of buildings outside the actual so-called fort. This is actually my last time to Russia. I went with a Kushaya group called Sununu Shadon, a dance group. And I had the great honor, they asked me to go and give a public lecture on their behalf to Russian audience, talking about the special relationship between Kushaya Pomo people and Russian people at Fort Ross, 200 years ago. And it was a special relationship. Here's the group arriving in Moscow. Where's Billy Rain? So we're honored today for many, many reasons. Here's a room full of shiny, happy people. You can sense that this is a great group of people. But a friend of mine's here, Billy Rain Panola from the Kushai Pomo, and the co-head of this dance group. I guess that's okay to say you're the co-founder. And Billy Rain's in this photo. If I turn around, I'll wince with my knee. And there's the dance group about to perform in Moscow. They were on their way to a cultural festival somewhere, probably I think Siberia, and we flew through Moscow. All right, what you really want to hear, Father Innocent. So we all know about Saint Innocent of Alaska. I had the great occasion, great honor, privilege of meeting his great, 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 great grandson at Fort Ross in 1989. And there he is on the left side, the man on the right, on the left side of the photo, that's Father Innocent. He's with the Metropolitan, Theodosis, and I forget the other gentleman's name, I think he was their driver. Has anyone ever heard of Father Innocent in this group? And you've probably all heard of Saint Innocent.
Yes, everyone, yes.
Yes. There we go.
Come on.
Still shiny, happy people. Father Innocent, he had been in the Soviet Merchant Marine, if I remember the story right. He was a medical officer. And anytime he was sailing in the Pacific, he dreamed of visiting Alaska and California and walking in the footsteps of his venerated ancestor. Those of you who were involved in history and politics and government and all know that in the 1980s it was kind of difficult for Soviet citizens to get up to Fort Ross. A lot of people were limited, I think, to 25 miles from Green Street, the consulate. And he wanted to see Fort Ross, he wanted to visit Alaska. It happened. He was able to get special permission from Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan to come to Fort Ross. On the right, that's him on the far left standing up. And he's just finished a 3-hour interview with our local press, including Gay LeBaron. Most amazing thing. He didn't speak English, he had a translator. And this interview went on all afternoon. And a lot of it was about the past, his ancestor, but most of it was about the future. What he thought, what he wanted, what he hoped for. And a lot of that came true quickly after. I could sense as an anthropologist that our world was about to change. I grew up during the Cold War, all of that. And we could sense that something is about to happen here. Don't know what. To this day, it'll sound hokey, but I think he had a lot to do with it. They did too, but Father Innocent. There was something about magic. I don't believe in magic, but something happened. It's like the world changed. Within months, we started having other Soviet visitors, and then later Russian visitors. And by Russian, I don't mean Russian American. There's always been Russian American visitors. You've heard about that today. But actual people coming from Soviet Union. And here's some of them here. There's 3 people here with our park staff coming over. And then later at lunch, here they are. And it was magical. So the park staff, here we are all going down to San Francisco to see a Soviet art exhibit. We're becoming not only are we interested because of our work, but as we met more and more Russian people, became very integrated and interested in the culture. So we could do a better job of not only protecting Fort Ross, but welcoming visitors. Here's, I can't read it from here, but this is the head of the Russian Duma, the Parliament, Senate. Fired into cannon at Fort Ross, I think in 1994. We had a number of by now, Russian Federation senators there. It was kind of cool. So Father Innocent played a big role in where we're at, post-Cold War. I'm not sure what the role was. Maybe it was magic, The second story I want to talk about is the cemetery. How many of you have actually been to Fort Ross and participated at the cemetery in the yearly? Yeah, about a third of you. And then some of you are going to go tomorrow for the first time probably. When I first saw the cemetery, we knew the cemetery was out there. We didn't know where. There was a large cross that had been put up by the church, one of the churches in the 1970s, that more or less marked the location. There was a little sign saying, on this windswept knoll, it's thought that 50 Russian men are buried, something like that. 50 Russian men. Turned out that was just part of the story. Here's the first photo I took out there. That's Sandy Osborne, Dr. Osborne, who ended up writing her PhD on the cemetery. And in the foreground, what's important is look at that old redwood laying there. I think it's gone now. I think it's rotted away, burned up or something. But those are the remnants of the original big monuments that you saw in this photograph. Father Vladimir was one of the first archpriests I worked with. He was on our Citizens Advisory Committee, and he said, we need to know where the graves are. We need to be able to honor our ancestors. There were cows grazing out there at the time also. He said, it's not really cool having all these cows grazing on the cemetery, on the graves that we can't mark. So in many ways, he had the first idea that I'm aware of, working with a couple of archaeologists to create this project. And they proposed it, and I said, no way. Because I never thought I could get the state to support going out and digging up a graveyard, especially at that time. But Father Derugan and the two archaeologists made such a good argument that my bosses said, okay, we'll do that. The second person that played a big role was Father Michael here. Who knew Father Michael? Yeah. Wonderful, wonderful man. He is the person that said to the Native Alaskan community, I think this is worth doing. And that was magic. His saying, I think this is something we should do, was important. I went to Alaska. I went up to Kodiak Island to make sure. And I had to go around and meet with the tribal elders, the village leaders. And the reason is, you probably know, by then we'd realized that there were a lot of Alutiiq people buried in the cemetery. It wasn't 50 Russian men. It was a lot of people, men, women, and children. Alaskan, Russian, and a mixture. So I went up and did a presentation, and with Father Michael's support, the Kodiak Islanders said yes. They gave us a prescription of what to do and how to do it. But they said, if you're working with Father Michael and the priest, we're okay with that. And then the third, and probably the most important, Father Alexander. Is Father Alexander here? Father Alexander was involved from the beginning to the end of this project in amazing ways. Here we are, this is at the very beginning, we're having a planning meeting. And this is mostly archaeologists and park staff. You see Sandy Osborne, Lynn Goldstein, you may have heard of Lynn Goldstein. Kent Lightfoot, the archaeologist. Lynn Goldstein actually did the archaeology for the cemetery. I don't know if Robin's in there or not. And then we went out, once we had all the permissions, which included the Kushayapomo, the Alaskan, and the church, we went out and started our excavation. We quickly realized we couldn't do it. The ground was too hard. There's a big field. Where do you start? So here we are doing an exploratory project before we gave up. And what we did is we brought in convicts. And we brought in a California Conservation Corps, the prison crew, who work outdoors and fight fires. And they love digging hard dirt. And that's what we had to do, dig hard dirt to get down to the top of the cemetery. And what had happened is Caltrans, when they built Highway 1, had buried the cemetery. and compacted a lot of the area either naturally or with their stuff. And a lot of our students, we had students from University of Wisconsin, just couldn't dig through what we call a durapan, which is like concrete. Convicts did. They actually enjoyed it. And so they would take off the upper 3 feet or so, and then the archaeologists would take over. And what you see on the right here is the top of actual graves. Once we got through all the overburden, you can see the delineation of the old graves, because the dirt will look different than the dirt that was never dug. And then the archaeologists excavated further, found the remains. This was all done with priests on site. Here they are working on some here. The ground is very acidic at Fort Ross, and people were buried in redwood coffins, and the coffins are very acidic. As a result, if we thought we were going to actually find a skeleton, we were wrong. We found pretty much ashes. We would see what looked like, and I'll be blunt, I don't want to embarrass anybody, but we would see what was the very end of maybe bones that were going to powder. In a couple cases, you could actually pick up a bone, but in most cases, it was either gone or it fell apart. So we were mostly looking at teeth. Teeth survived, so we saw teeth. And we saw boots and uniforms, beads, things like that. More than I thought we'd find. I didn't think we'd find many artifacts. Because one of my friends, one of the Orthodox priests, said, yeah, you should only find a cross or a crucifix. We found crosses, crucifixes. We also found beads, and we found a sword and boots, a military coat, because there was a variety of people buried there. And the one thing they had in common is they were members of the church. They were all buried according to Russian Orthodox protocols. As we would excavate graves, then we had to rebury people back into their area. And that's where we always had, the priests would come out from different churches, Russian Orthodox churches. And I can't remember who this is. This might be someone in the room. Anyone see yourself in this photo? Do you know who these? Oh, Father, yeah, I remember. Okay. That's him in yellow or black?
He's wearing vestments.
That's okay. That's good to remember. No. And we had press also. The press was very interested because they heard the state was digging up a cemetery. And so this is Channel 3 from Sacramento. And they actually did a 2-part special, and they did a pretty sympathetic, positive program. And I found my copy. I'd made a copy of it when it came out. You can go to my YouTube channel and see it. My YouTube channel is just Breck Parkman, And I have this, it's about a 5-minute, and you can see the excavation, you can see some of the priests, you can see the students, a lot of talking about, the interpretation. Father Alexander oversaw the production of the crosses, and here we are installing the crosses that you see today. Some of the crosses they've rotted away, fallen down, they've been replaced over time. We chose just a basic design. We knew that at the time of the cemetery, there were other styles of crosses out there, but we didn't know who had what cross. So working with the church, it was decided the best thing was just to do the very basic, if that makes sense, to mark each grave. The most important thing for the priest was that we mark the grave. And someday, if we find a photograph or a diary that says, here was this, here was that, I went to Alaska to look at Russian cemeteries, and there's a variety of types of crosses and furnishings. We weren't able to do that here. And we didn't want to do a Disneyland type of, make-believe thing by saying we'll do 5 of these, 10 of those. This was what we ended up doing. And there were a few people who weren't happy with that. And any of you who worked for a living, preached, had churches, that sometimes people aren't happy with everything. But I think over time, people have realized that this was the thing to do. This was the rededication a few years ago. There's Father Alexander with Glenn Ferris. We heard from Sue about Glenn Ferris and Dr. Lightfoot from Berkeley and yours truly. And the cemetery today. It's an improvement over a field with a bunch of cows. I like cows, I like fields. But when there's 100 and maybe 43 people buried there, we found a lot more than 50 graves. We found a lot more than Russian people, and we found a lot more than men. There were a lot of children there. There were a lot of women there. There were a lot of Alaskan natives there. And the one thing that apparently everybody had in common is they were Russian Orthodox. That brings me to the third story, the Fort Ross Man. Probably no one's heard of the Fort Ross Man, except you. I can't remember the year, it's probably, 1999. We had a lot of rain that winter, and a hiker got off the trail, went down from the chapel at Fort Ross to the creek, and saw what he thought was a skull. There was an active mud flow. And he came back and told the ranger, and the ranger called the coroner, and the coroner came out and said, I'm not going to go down there. It's probably historic. So I got called, and Bill Walton, the ranger at the time, and I took ropes, and we did some ropes. We had to go down this very steep hillside in the rainstorm, and then get out on this active mud flow that was going into the creek. It was an interesting setting. And there's Bill, I think, pointing at the skull. There was a burial that had come out of the hillside above. And this is just at the edge of the cliff from the chapel. Not in the cemetery, which is part of the story. At the edge of the cliff near the chapel. And this grave had washed out and was slowly going down. What do? You know? So we did our best to recover. And I think we recovered Sandra Holloman did the analysis. Sandra Holloman is a physical anthropologist. She looked at the remains, and I think she said we had 90 to 95% of this gentleman for reburial, which is what we wanted to do. When we first saw the skull, when I recovered the skull from this mud flow, we mistakenly thought that this was a Kashaya person from Matini, or from the Kashaya Reservation. And the teeth indicated a diet that was similar to earlier Kashaya, eating a lot of ground up acorns and stone bowls. The teeth were kind of worn down in such a way. We were wrong. But at the time we thought we were right, and I notified the reservation. And the elders began a series of ceremonies or preparations to welcome the ancestor home. And we were told you got 3 days or 4 days, and then we'll rebury them at the Kashaya. Bill Walton took the remains and laid them out in the library at Fort Ross in anatomical position, and when Sandra came in to look at them, she said, oh my gosh, I don't think that's Kashaya. She saw things within the skeleton that suggested this probably wasn't a Kashaya person. So she told the people, and this is Violet, Vivian, and Otis, mostly, Billy Rain, she's telling them, we're not positive this is a Kashaya person. And the Kashaya did not want to do what they were going to do with the remains unless they knew it was an ancestor. Sandra was able to look at DNA, and the tribe approved it. We looked at the DNA, and what we found out is that this individual had a Russian father and Alaskan native mother, what the Russians at the time called Creoles. Wasn't Kashaya. So the Kashaya said, okay, it's an Alaskan situation and a church. So we talked to the church, we talked to Native Alaskans, and we were asked to return this person to as close as where he was buried as possible, which is what we did. Here's a bunch of us, including Robin. Terrible early digital photo of mine, but you get the idea. We had a ceremony, and we reinterred this person probably within 30 feet of where he had washed out. And he's there now. We don't know who he is, but he had a Russian father, an Alaskan mother. Why he wasn't in the cemetery? Maybe he wasn't Russian Orthodox. Or, more likely, he died before the cemetery was created, which I think was 1818, right? In coming here this morning, I was thinking more and more about this. When he wrote it out, he went feet first down the hill. Head at the top, feet at the bottom, 3 locations where the remains were, 3 loci, about 30 feet apart. So when he came out of his grave, he had his head one way, up coast, his feet the other way, which mimicked what we saw in the cemetery. It was that east-west orientation. Could be a coincidence, probably wasn't. We didn't find a cross or crucifix. We looked really hard. We used a metal detector, but it was such a disaster area, we could have missed that. So my assumption is he was a Russian Orthodox man of Russian Alaskan ancestry who was buried there before the formal cemetery was created. And that tells a story by itself. There are other people buried out there that we don't know about. And when they rerouted Highway 1 that used to go through the fort, Caltrans hit a burial also in, I think, 1972, 73. So prior to the creation of the actual cemetery, when people died, they were buried here and there probably. And after enough people had died, someone said, we really need a formal cemetery. So he was probably one of the first. The windmill. Those of you who've been there have seen the new windmill. And I'll say the new Russian windmill versus the old Russian windmill, which you see on the left of this old drawing, historic drawing. Can you see that windmill? So we know that the Russians had a windmill at Fort Ross. Again, like the cemetery, we're not sure exactly where. Turns out we had an interpretive panel for years that was, I think, spot on. But in 2011, you might remember the state of California was going to close Fort Ross. And word reached Moscow. And people in Russia said, oh, no, you can't do that. So it began a dialogue, how can we keep Fort Ross open? And we ended up getting sponsorship and help from Russia. We had a lot of deferred maintenance, things that needed to be done that hadn't been done. And we had a list, and one of the things on the list said, you know, redo the windmill, find the windmill and build it. So we gave that list to Moscow and said, what can you help us with? And they chose a couple of projects, working on the Rochev House, which is the one structure at Fort Ross that still has original fabric. When was it built? Rochev House, when was the Rochev House built?
1836.
1820, there you go. So, so that was one, and Park said, great. And then the Russian government said, and the windmill. And this is where it kind of gets tricky. We had asked for their help, but when they said the windmill, some of my upper managers started saying, why do they want to do a windmill? Well, we asked them, but they wouldn't do the windmill. Turns out, the president of the Russian Federation at the time, and I'll butcher the name, but Medvedev, has a friend who loves windmills and makes things like that. So it was perfect, except he wanted to do it in St. Petersburg. And you know, we were expected to build a windmill on the site. And they wanted to do it within like 5 months because that was the 2012 anniversary of 200 years of Russian Orthodoxy in the Americas. It's like 5 months. You know, we got to go out and find the location, do archaeology, do lab work, figure out what it looked like, and it was becoming a political nightmare that could have led us back into a Cold War. I went out and did a metal detector, and where Glenn Ferris thinks the windmill is, and where that drawing indicates it, I found this old hand-wrought spike here, which is probably evidence that the windmill was right where, you know, it was. But there was no way we could build a windmill there that looked like historically accurate at the time. So my coworker, Mary Ann Hurley, a historian, came up with a brilliant idea. She said, if you get outside the historic landmark boundary, you can do an interpretive exhibit, even if it's not completely accurate. You know, so we chose the location we chose because it's not within the landmark district. And if we fudge a little bit, the Russians wanted to use cedar. The Russians at Fort Ross used redwood. Is that a big deal? Is that a big difference? If you're a historic preservation officer, that's a pretty big difference. We weren't going to make a windmill out of redwood if it's being built at Russia. It was already under construction, and I didn't know that. Here it is under construction in St. Petersburg. That's actually the windmill being built. And it's like a tinker toy project. They build it and then take it apart, they shipped it over here, and then they reassembled. It was brilliant. And here we are. So I had to go out and find a location. So I took engineers and ecologists and rangers and a bunch of us, and we went out and we found 2 spots that we thought would work. And then we offered them to the Russian government, and they chose this one. And I presented this to the Russian people, or to the Russian politicians I was working with, as a good spot because you can see it when you first come into the park. You'll see it tomorrow. When you first come into the park, you see it. It's very welcoming. It's the only project I ever worked on that was discussed in the White House. that I'm aware of during one of the summits. We were having some, let's just say, management difficulties making that 5-month deadline and finding a location. And so it went all the way to Obama. But the person I can never say it, I get tongue-tied. And Hillary Clinton took a special interest in it. Obama asked her to bird dog the project, and she had Dianne Feinstein be the local person, and we got weekly calls, and we had to do weekly updates where we're at. And what was happening is that the Russians and the Americans weren't communicating. There was a cultural barrier of some sort, and they couldn't understand why we just couldn't do it. And so finally, they asked me to get involved. So I went to a couple of meetings with the higher ups of the state and the Russian government, and things like Renova Foundation. And it's like, man, this is like pushing a dinosaur up a mountain. This ain't gonna work. They're not communicating right. There's something wrong here. And then the Russians brought in a historian from Russia who works in New York, and she made a presentation, and she said, here's what it is. She said, when a Russian person visits in Russia or out of Russia, they look for two things. They look for a church, which feeds the soul, and they look for a windmill, which feeds the body. And if they see a church and a windmill, they feel at home. And when she said that, I looked around, and the bureaucrats, the state park bureaucrats and the governor's office bureaucrats, they got it. You could see it. It was like magic. It was like being with Father Innocent. You could see magic happening. And then it worked out. Everybody agreed we did it. And there's the dedication. The late Liz Burko, our superintendent, and someone you've probably heard of, Victor Vexelberg, from Renova. He's the person that funded it. He had a meeting with Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger earlier when we were closing the park, and he said, I want to help. And he was going to write a check and buy it. He actually thought that the state of California would sell him Fort Ross to keep it open and protect it. And then the governor had to explain, no, that's not what we're looking for. But fortunately, they were able to work it out and get help, hundreds of thousands of dollars in help. And there's the windmill today.
Hank is here. Good one standing at the windmill.
Is Hank back there?
Yeah, he is.
This is Hank interpreting the windmill. This is where I look at my... I'm still okay for a few minutes?
Yeah, you are.
All right. So I got Hank's here, and I don't know what Hank, when he did the interpretation, if he talks about this windmill. I'll tell you though, and just between the group of us here, this windmill is more than a windmill. It's more than a windmill. It's a monument of cooperation and collaboration. And in my mind, and in some of my writings, I declare it's a monument of peace. And we need monuments of peace. If you stand at the windmill tomorrow and look up the coast, if it's clear, see if you can see the Bufano Peace Monument at Timber Cove, 2 miles away. Has anyone seen the Peace Monument I'm talking about? Those that live here do. It's that one right there. 96 feet tall. He started it in fall of 1962. He being Benny Bufano, sculptor. Remember fall of 1962? Fall of 1962, 8 times a day, I'd collapse and roll up under my desk for a week. And once a day, we'd get up my 3rd, 4th grade class and go out in the hallway and hunker down. It was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And during the missile crisis, Benny Bufano started this, what I call a symbolic intercontinental ballistic missile for peace. And the windmill, which in my mind mirrors this, is just 2 miles down the coast, reaching to the sky. So if you get a chance to bar, see if you can also the Benny Bufano. I did a essay years ago for California history about Benny Bufano's monument, and I called it Missile of Peace, because he was doing, from 1939 on, he did several missiles. There was one at SFO, San Francisco Airport, for years. That's now on Brotherhood Way near Lake Merced, which is a 38-foot tall projectile. And his idea is missiles for peace, you know? Let's get this right. And we're still trying to get it right. The windmill gets us closer, I think. Things are trouble in the world right now. But as long as you have people, like the people that wanted to build a windmill, or Benny Bufano, or this room, as long as we have people like us, we're slowly going to get there. Some final thoughts. I've known a number of people that we call Mr. Fort Ross. Ranger John McKenzie in the 50s was the first one. He's the guy with the cannon there. He was the ranger curator at Fort Ross and did so many wonderful things. I had the chance to meet him when I first started working there. Another was Ranger Dan Murley in the lower right there at Fort Ross. Dan was an amazing ranger. Did living history, he did publications, amazing person. He's gone now, unfortunately. Glenn Ferris, who's up there speaking in the visitor center in this photo, Mr. Fort Ross. A lot of people think of Glenn because of his academic background and all the publications he's done is Mr. Fort Ross. And then below him, one of the newer Mr. Fort Rosses, Kit Lightfoot from Berkeley. Kit's father was John McKenzie's eye doctor. And back then, doctors used to make road trips. And once a year, Kent with his dad would go up and visit John McKenzie. John would have his eyes checked. Kent grew up wanting to be a ranger at Fort Ross. He became a professor of archaeology at Berkeley, but he spent 20 years working with me doing archaeology at Fort Ross. So here are 4 Mr. Fort Rosses. There's more. There's probably some in this room here. I didn't even think about some of the priests that are like Mr. Fort Ross. But that said, I've only known one mother of Fort Ross. And there's truly, I can't think of another mother of Fort Ross. There's mothers of Matini. I see one in the room. And again, Matini is a name that's thousands of years old for what became Fort Ross in our knowledge, our database. Database, that's a weird word. In our time. But for Fort Ross, for the story of the Russian settlement, there's only one mother of Fort Ross. And I'm so happy and I'm so proud that she thought enough of me to invite me to be here today. This is truly a great experience. And I think there's a few minutes if anybody has questions.
Thank you for these wonderful, wonderful insights. Just on a personal note, I'm curious, when you first applied to the California State Parks for a job, did your last name help you get the job?
No, I changed it the second week. I figured to get promoted. My name was Highwayman, and I didn't want to work for Caltrans. I tell people that. No one ever called, when I was a kid, my first name is Breck, and I got called a Breck Girl a lot. Older people in the room will remember Breck Girl, Breck shampoo. My mother named me after her favorite shampoo, and I got kidded a lot. Now, most younger people don't have a clue what Breck means that way. But Parkman, some people say, oh, it's a good thing but the funny thing is state parks, they never picked up on either of those. And I just hit the ground running. I came in and they said, you're supposed to be working in Mount Diablo, but we changed, now you're going to San Diego, and it was a whirlwind. Best thing, other than meeting my wife and having my son, one of the best things that ever happened to me. I can't imagine if I hadn't become a state park archaeologist. I wanted to be a professor, and I'm really glad I became a state park archaeologist. It allowed me to do things. I've been all over the world doing archaeology because of that. I was Clint Eastwood's driver a number of times. I took Clint hiking a few times because of my work there. Hung out with the Grateful Dead quite a bit because I was documenting their archaeology and history. And I was able to do things that, as a professor, I wouldn't have done. I would have just spent my days in classrooms with shiny, happy people, which we're doing today. But
Another question? When you raise your hands, stand up. Thank you.
Breck, thanks for your stories. I was paying very close attention when you talked about the cemetery and finding the remains of the interred people there and how the soil was so acidic that there was basically no bones. So can you help me understand why when you found the man, the Fort Ross man, who was buried before the cemetery even, and was in that same soil presumably, why he had 90 to 95% of his remains to be found? Okay, what's the mystery?
Excellent question. No one's ever asked that. That's a really good question. So, I'll think really fast on my feet here. He probably wasn't in a redwood coffin. The ground by itself is acidic, but it's spotty. And where the cemetery is especially acidic. And that may have something to do with the highway project and putting spoils out there. Redwood, though, will break down human remains faster than if you're not in a redwood coffin. So he may not have been in a coffin. We looked and looked and looked, and then we looked some more for nails, because the coffins in the cemetery were overly, all types of nails, and they weren't all uniform. They were all different sizes. Lots of nails. Every grave had nails and hardware. Some of the graves had the remnants of what was left of the wooden coffins, little pieces. This guy, we couldn't find any nails. I found one piece of metal right here on his hip, on his waist. And to this day, we don't really know what that is. I thought it might be a broken sword, the blade of a sword. It kind of had the shape of a, so it was very rusty. But the individual had a green stain on his hip bone. So that metal had been on it for a long time. He might have had some sort of an implement in his waistband when he was buried. That's the only thing we found. Didn't find a cross, no beads, nothing else, and no nails. So if he wasn't buried in a coffin, and if that particular area is less acidic, that would explain why his remains would look really, really fresh versus what we saw. If we had not done the restoration of the cemetery when we did it, another 50 years, even the teeth were starting to disappear probably. And the teeth's the hardest part of our remains. So, and the soil, the soil becomes a spiritual thing, went back in also to the graves. So no one left the park, no one left the site. All the analysis was done right there the best we could. We had the Smithsonian there because we thought, here's an opportunity to really learn about these ancestors. And when we realized they're not here anymore, just the teeth mostly. It was disappointing for the forensic anthropologists who were going to tell us all about, gender, and age, and things like that. At the end of the day, though, the church was able to mark the graves, and they were able to do the last rites. Because if you do the math, most of these people were buried without the benefit of a priest. So.
Okay, there's a question here. Okay.
Thank you again, Breck. It's wonderful to see you. Thank you for your fine service through the years at Team Fort Ross. And, following up on the Redwood theme, for the sake of those who will be visiting tomorrow for the first time, or maybe first time in a long time, as you know, the windmill that stands there, that windmill that, as you said, was made actually of pine, sometimes called kedrity, it's cedar, Siberian pine. Sadly, as we know, pine doesn't hold up as well as redwood. And so sadly, the pine windmill that was made in Russia and reconstructed at Fort Ross has rotted. And the main hub for the sails, has broken. The main wings, are on the ground. So just so it's not a surprise for those of you visiting, to me, sadly, it's a symbol of Russian-American relations now. And I think maybe with citizen support, supporting our state parks,
So here's
not
the
just
funny
in the
thing.
cemetery, but there perhaps we do have some local craftsmen that have reassembled certain parts,
Could
but
probably
we
do
need
that.
to complete that restoration as well.
So when we were negotiating, I was just helping do the cultural thing, but we had state park managers on one side and Russian officials on the other, and we were meeting in Sacramento at the Capitol, and some of these meetings were pretty intense. And once we realized, they built a windmill, it's on the way, we've got to get the site prepared, the blade came up. Now, can you have a windmill if you don't have, what is it called, Hank, a blade? What's the thing that twirls?
As far as I know.
Is it a windmill if you don't have a blade? State parks didn't want a blade because they thought, someone will get hurt. It's dangerous. The Russians, when we said that, were like, really? We're going to build a windmill, but it's not going to have a blade. So then the compromise was, it'll be fixed. It won't be a functional blade. And the state of California, all the way up to, White House, understanding was this will arrive with a non-functioning blade.
Wow.
And when it got set up, that baby was just turning in the wind. And the minute, it was too late. I mean, it's there, it's beautiful, and it's a windmill. So maybe someday it'll get fixed. Because ultimately, it's not a windmill unless you have a blade that turns in the wind. And like the historian told us, the Russian historian, that's what Russian visitors look for. And I'm not Russian, but I have to say now, when I go on trips, you know, I look for churches. You can find churches in most America, but I look for windmills too. Because I love fresh bread, and that's what people are reacting to, fresh bread. And feeding your soul, church feeding your soul, the bread feeding your body. And I love that. And it turned the room. It changed the whole atmosphere of a room when she said that.
Okay, one more question over there, or maybe a couple more, but right
So
here.
earlier you said that looking at it as a fort is kind of a weird way to look at it. We should look at it more as a settlement. Do we have an idea of how big Fort Ross was, or what the population might have been at its peak? Because, like, you know, when you look at like online and pictures, you just have what's there now. I'm curious how sprawling it might have been, how many buildings and settlements there might have been.
So you have a fortified center, and you can go to Italy or France, some of the old towns, and you can see that. You know, fortified center. And under attack, people fall back and they close the gate. That's in Russia. It's called, I think it's called Ostrog. It's a Siberian architecture, this type of architecture. But the people are living outside. At Fort Ross, the people that lived inside the fort were the VIPs. You know, it's like you can go to Mar-a-Lago today, but you're probably not going to get in. Most of us. People live there. People live, you know, in these compounds, but the workers live outside. So at Fort Ross, the workers, and that could be Russian, Alaskan, California Native people, are living outside. There's 3 communities outside the fort, outside the stockade. I'll call it stockade. There's Alaskan Natives. We call that the Alaskan Native site, Native Alaskan site. It's out on the point. You'll see that tomorrow. A lot of people say, oh, poor Alaskans, they got the worst area. They're out in the wind. They chose that. If you go to Alaska, you see Alaskan sites, archaeological sites, out on windy points because they're butchering a lot of sea mammals. And it helps maintain the flies and all. The Alaskan, or the California people, the Kashaya, are living in their village of Mutiny, which is on the other side of the compound. And then the Russians, including some of the Creoles, are living in the Sloboda, the Russian village, which is over near the Call House, if you know the Call House. So 3 directions from the compound, you have Russian, Alaskan, Native California villages. The 4th direction is the cemetery, which is another community of the ancestors. How many people? Robin or Hank probably knows that number. It changes during the years. But Alexei Istomin, Dr. Istomin from Moscow, who I showed his photo earlier, we're out in the snow at the Kremlin, he's got his fur hat on. He did a census in 1991. He did the Kuskov census. Ivan Kuskov did a complete census in maybe 1820, 1821. 2021. And he names all the people, including the Native Californians that are part of that community. And I can't remember the exact number, but there's a lot. And the cemetery reflects that also. The cemetery, we were expecting 50 Russian men, which you would think in a fort. And it's not that, it's a big settlement.
You might add also, not to forget, Port Rumyantsov, Bodega Bay was known as Port Rumyantsov. It was established before Port Ross in 1806. Also in the 1830s, farms, ranches were created after there was not the possibility of getting grain from those Spanish missions. The Russians planted grain further south and inland where it's better to grow, including in the Great and Occidental area, in Bodega, not Bodega Bay, and inland from Jenner and Duncan's Mill. So that whole bigger area really does create more community, a colony, settlement, and even fort isn't quite right translation. Klepus is fortress. It's actually a sheep.
Yeah. Someone mentioned earlier, the Alaskan Natives were such good hunters. They wiped out the sea otter within less than a decade. So you have a bureaucracy now. The Russian American company has a bureaucracy. And do you just go home now? or do you find another way to sustain your community? And they came up with the fact that they could grow food, but they didn't know what they were doing. And they were growing food out on the terraces. And there were two things that haunted them. One was the fog. They had a word for it. Their crops rotted. And the other, if you ever saw the movie Caddyshack with Bill Murray, remember the gophers, brown squirrels? The gophers, they hated them because they were eating the potato small. And finally, they brought over an agronomist from Russia, Chernica, and he said, no, you need to get inland, like Hank just said. And they created 4 ranches inland. And they began to produce. But by then, the missions were established in the North Bay. And the Russians had a very different relationship with local native people than the missions did. And later, the Americans did. The Russians needed native people to trade. They needed to trade. The missions needed people to convert and make them into Spanish citizens. That was part of the mission history. Later, the Americans just needed them out of the way. So 3 different cultural, and the Russians by far were the best for native people. Not that it was always perfect. By the end of the Russian occupation, they were having to take, against their wishes, people to work the fields. But they didn't take the Kashaya or the Bodega because they were intermarried. They went further inland to find work groups. So that created animosity. And the missions were creating animosity. And guerrillas started raiding the crops and burning the crops. So it became a very expensive thing. And I think that led to partly the Russians pulling out. There was a lot of suspicion from Spain and later Mexico too. As they expanded into these ranches, it's like they're getting closer to Sonoma, San Rafael. And so there was a lot going on. Incredible history though.
Absolutely, thank you.
All right, thank you, Brett.
Thank you all.